In this video, we're going to talk about the concept of post-flop hand strength. So when it comes to post-flop play, we can categorize our hand into one of four different categories. It's either going to be a strong value hand, a medium strength value hand, a drawing hand, or a weak hand. Now, one thing to note on here is by the time we get to the river, we no longer have draws, right? Our drawing hands, if they complete, they're either going to be a strong value hand or a medium value hand. And if they don't complete, well, they're going to be a weak hand. So understand that there are three different categories on the river, but on the flop and the turn, all four of these categories exist. So let's talk about them one by one. So let's start off talking about our strongest hands, our strong value hands. These are hands that we are looking to see bet for value. And we're looking to extract value from weaker holdings post-flop. Now, in terms of these hands, they can range from anywhere from top pair, top kicker, all the way up to a royal flush. Now, there's a concept of relative hand strength, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture, but that plays an important role in determining how strong our hand is. One thing that I want to point out with this is just like when we talked about board texture, just don't think about your hand as either being strong or medium. There's a spectrum here of our strongest hands to our weakest hands. I mean, we could actually type in weak over here, but from medium to strong, right? We could have medium strong hands, or we could have medium weak hands. We could have medium strong over here, like semi-strong, or all the way up to very strong. So think about it as a spectrum on here as well when I talk about these. Now, in terms to how strong our hand is, again, it's based on a variety of factors, but it might be worth one c-bet, whether that be a c-bet on the flop, or a c-bet on the turn, or a c-bet on the river, or it might be worth trying to play stacks for. Let's say we're in a 3-bet pot, we flop a set of eights on an ace, 8 deuce board, and we have ace king, ace queen, and pocket aces within our opponent's range. Well, we're going to look to play for stacks. Sometimes we're going to lose to a set of aces, but a lot of the time we're going to win against ace king or ace queen. So again, the relative strength of our hand, it's going to determine how many value bets it's worth. So that's our strong hands. Now there's our medium strength hands. And medium strength hands are hands that we can sometimes bet for value. And this would typically be called a thin value bet or a semi-thin value bet against weaker opponents that are going to call with a wide post-flop calling range. But for the most part, these are going to be hands that we're typically going to try to get to what we call showdown, meaning get to the river and to show down our hands for as cheaply as possible. And if our opponents are showing aggression, we'll probably typically fold these hands unless we're making exploitative adjustments. Now, medium strength hands, these can range from top pair with an okay to a weak kicker, but they're typically going to be top pair with a weaker kicker or middle pair or even worse. Now, with that said, when we talk about the concept of relative hand strength in the next lecture, understand that a medium strength hand could actually be a hand that's probably as strong as a straight or weak flush. If we put a stronger hand within our opponent's range, well, even though we have a strong hand from an absolute perspective on the ranking charts of hands in Texas Hold'em, but relative to our opponent's hand, it's not that strong. So I want you to understand that as well. Now, let's talk about drawing versus weak hands. Well, drawing hands are pretty straightforward, right? These are going to be our draws. These are going to be our flush draws and our straight draws, or a combination of both of those and other draws. And these can either be played aggressively as a semi-bluff or passively by checking and calling, and if we're not getting the proper odds, also folding. Our weakest hands, well, they're our weakest holdings. These are going to be our mediocre pairs, maybe bottom pair or fourth best pair on certain board textures. Or these are hands that we just completely whiffed out on the flop and we have no chance of improving whatsoever with the draw. And with these hands, against any sort of aggression, we're typically going to be checking and folding. But for an exploitative adjustment, if nobody is fighting for the pot, we can actually look to turn these into bluffs and try to win the hand without going to showdown. So let's say, for example, that we're against one opponent and our hand is just a completely weak hand, but our opponent has checked on the flop and the turn and then on the river, and it's our turn to act. Then we can bluff our hand if we have little to no showdown value. So that's an exploitative adjustment with our weakest hands. All right, so let's return to the concept of being balanced. And I want to talk about this before we go through a couple of examples, just to give you an idea of different hands in different examples and whether they are strong, a medium strength, a drawing, or a weak hand, and what we would typically do. So there are going to be hands that go within to our betting range, and there are going to be hands that go within to our checking range. And I know that we briefly talked about this earlier, but I want to revisit it. So hands that we bet are going to be a combination of our strong value hands and our drawing hands. And again, by having a combination of both of these, we protect our betting range because we keep our opponents guessing. Conversely, hands that we're checking are going to be a combination of our medium strength hands and our weakest hands. Again, now we protect our checking range because our opponents, if they're c-betting us a lot and we're only checking back our weakest hands and only value betting our strongest hands, that makes us very exploitable. So we protect them by putting a combination of both of these within our range. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, the thing is if we don't know anything about our opponent, and let's say that we play in a player pool where there are some semi-decent opponents, we can default to this strategy. And then once we know something about our opponents, we can start making exploitative adjustments. So understand that we can deviate from this once we start looking to exploit our opponents. But if we know nothing about them and we think that a majority of the player pool is decent, we can default to this strategy, and it's going to be a good default balanced c-betting strategy. Okay, so with that said, let's take a look at a couple of examples. So let's go ahead and I'm going to pull in Equilab. I actually don't know how much we're going to use it on this slide, but I want to have it ready just in case. So we have a board texture that's semi-wet. We have the ace of hearts and the 9-7 of spades. So there's a straight draw and a flush draw, but clearly certain hands are going to be strong value hands, but they're going to be vulnerable to a fair amount of draws. So let's take a look at this. So what can we categorize into these different hands? So our strongest hands are going to include sets, top pair with a decent kicker, and two pair hands. Pretty straightforward, right? So if we look at this board texture, of course, we're going to have sets of aces, sets of nines, sets of sevens. We're going to have ace jack, ace queen, ace king, and we're going to have our two pair combos. So we're going to have ace 9, ace 7, and 9-7. That's going to be our strongest hands. These are going to be hands that we want to c-bet for value. Now, because our betting range includes drawing hands, let's take a look at those next. So let's say we're the pre-flop aggressor. Well, we have lots of drawing hands on here, right? We have hands that include spade flush draws and straight draws. So we have jack 10, jack 8, 10-8, 8-6, and we have a lot of flush draws. Now, I only included a small sample of flush draws in here, but we could even include more. Now, these combined with these are strong value hands and drawing hands. These go into our betting range, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the color to green, meaning these are going to be hands that we want to bet, and I want to show you why we want to bet these hands. Now on the flip side, we have our checking range, and let me go ahead and color these into red, meaning these aren't hands that we're going to bet. And let's take a look at the hands and we'll revisit the equities. So let me go ahead and change my color back to yellow real quick. So our medium strength value hands, what are those going to be on here? Well, it's going to be pocket tens to pocket aces, right? Because it's not top pair, but they're decent pairs. It's going to be top pair with a weaker kicker. Ace 10, we could even put some weaker aces in here. It's going to be middle pair, pocket nines as well. So these are going to be examples of our medium strength hands. Again, we could put more in here, but this is a decent sample size. And then our weakest hands. These are hands that we just completely whiffed on this board. So hands such as pocket deuces up to pocket sixes, which are going to be fourth best pair. Other Broadway combos that just completely missed out on this flop. Now, let's take a look at our equities and let's talk about why we bet and why we check. Well, take a look at the equities. We bet our strongest value hands, well, because we can bet for value. And they have a crap load of equity, right? They have a lot of equity. So we want to bet these. Well, why don't we bet our medium strength value hands? Well, look at their equity compared to our strong value hands. Can we get value? No, not really, not a lot of the time. Then if that's the case, why would we bet our drawing hands? Well, look at their equity of improving on this board. This really isn't the strongest board, and I could have put more flush draws in here. I could have put more straight draws in here potentially, but I didn't. I kept it fairly low, but if I included more draws, its equity would actually increase a bit. So these two combined have the highest probability of being the best hand by the river. These two have the lowest chance of being the best hand by the river. So that's why we really put these into our checking range, and that's why we put these two into our betting range. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted those. So that's an example of a wet board texture and breaking down those 4 different categories. Now let's take a look at one more example before we end this lecture. So let's take a look at a very dry board. King, 8, deuce, rainbow, right? King of hearts, 8 of diamonds, 2 of clubs. And I put wet flop in here, but this is actually supposed to be a dry flop. And let me see if it will actually change on here. All right, got that fixed real quick for you guys. So one thing I want to note, we do not have any drawing hands that will complete on the turn. So this whole area here is excluded from this dry flop. So our 3 categories on here are going to be our strong value hands, our medium strength value hands, and our weak hands. I didn't include backdoor draws because they really aren't our strongest draws. I wanted to include draws that would complete on the turn. So excluding these, let's take a look at our strongest value hands. Well, these include sets and top pair with a good kicker. So sets of kings, pocket aces, sets of 8s, sets of deuces, ace king, king jack, and king queen. And look at the amount of equity here that we have with these hands. We have almost 80% equity with our strong value hands. Now let's take a look at our middle strength hands, our medium strength hands, our middling pairs. Well, pocket 9s all the way up to pocket queens that are going to be between both of these. We have some weaker king X combos for top pairs, such as king 10 and king 9. We have our 8X combos, so maybe like a 10-8 or 9-8 or a jack 8. And I included some of them, but not all of them. So these are going to be our medium strength hands. And look at the amount of equity they have. They don't really have that much equity on this board. We have no drawing hands. And then we have our weakest hands. So we have pocket 3s up to pocket 7s. We have Broadway combos that completely whiffed. We have pocket 2s. There's just a bunch of really junky hands. Look at the equity that they have. And if we combine both of these two, compared to the equity of our strongest hands, we can see why we are really not that incentivized to actually see bet the flop with our strongest hands. So on dry board textures, remember I said earlier in an earlier lecture that we're actually incentivized to slow play our strongest hands on a dry board texture, because these other two, and let's get rid of all the highlighting, our middle strength hands and our weakest hands combined, they have around roughly 20% chance of winning combined when we're at 80% combined. We are not combined, but with the strongest value hands, we're at 80% equity chance of winning. So on a wet board texture, we're incentivized to see bet both our strong value hands and our drawing hands, but on a dry board texture, we're actually not incentivized. We want our opponents to catch up with a worst hand. So let's say we check this flop with all of these hands, and we get our opponent to fire out on the turn with a pair of 9s up to a pair of queens, or king 9 or king 10, or even a pair of 8s. That's a good result for us. On the flip side, going back to the wet flop, we want to bet these hands because, well, our opponents have more equity with their drawing hands now. And if we combine drawing hands plus medium strength hands plus weakest hands combined, it's definitely a lot more equity than with the dry board. So anyways, that's going to conclude this lecture where we talked about the different 4 categories of hands and we did our examples. So we talked about strong value, medium strength, drawing hands, and weak hands. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys at the next lecture. Take care.